Libby, are you muted or do I have to unmute you?
No, I could unmute myself.
Okay, great, thanks.
Mhm.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to give folks just another couple of minutes to trickle in. I still see people entering the room, but I also want to be conscientious that we have a lot of material to get through over the course of our 2 hours together today. So why don't we give it just another minute or two, and then we will get started. All right, good afternoon. For those of you I've not met before, my name is Alina Vasquez, and I am with Human Services Research Institute. We are the consultant who's been working closely with the department over the last couple of years in the development of the new budget model. Our training today is part one of a two-part series directed for support brokers as an overview of the new budget model. Let's start with a couple of housekeeping issues. The first thing I want to ask everyone is please be sure to ask questions. We know that this is quite a bit of information we're going to be covering over the course of today. This is truly intended to be an introduction, not your only opportunity to learn this information. We will be pausing periodically throughout this training to try to open up the lines and let people ask questions verbally. You also are welcome to type your questions into chat at any time. Because I am sharing a full screen version of my computer, I won't necessarily see the chats as they pop up automatically, but we will be pausing throughout the training today to give a chance for people to get those questions answered. A copy of this training and the recording that you'll see is currently being made will be made available after this training on the My Choice Matters website. I'll also just remind folks that this is part one of a two-part series specifically for support brokers. Part two is targeted at covering the new forms associated with the new budget model, as well as new costing sheets, and will be held on two occasions, both on May 4th and on May 11th. The last housekeeping issue that I'm sure you guys already heard is that I want to apologize ahead of time. I share my office with a very barky dog, and if she hears anything too loudly overhead, you may hear her pipe up now and again. So I apologize ahead of time for that. With that, why don't we go ahead and get started and do a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. Today, we're going to take a chance to overview the new assessments that are being used, to talk about the new support levels and service mix and how they are assigned, to discuss the verification review process and exactly what verification flagging is. We're going to discuss how a participant's budget is determined, go over the model mixes, explain the new types of budget modifications, discuss the impacts of the public health emergency and the American Rescue Plan, introduce a new concept known as mid-year plans, and discuss three types of mid-year plans as a result of a change in condition, a service mix change request, or an off-cycle verification request. And we'll end today talking about some new service-specific requirements and reviewing some existing service-specific requirements. First, just a quick bit of background. As I'm sure all the folks on the line here today are aware, this action and the implementation of a new budget model is the result of a lawsuit known as KWV Armstrong. This was a class action that was filed in Idaho, where the court ruled that the existing budget tool, which is currently being used to set budgets for adults, violated individuals' due process rights because it was unreliable. The department and class counsel, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, entered a settlement agreement back in 2016. Under that settlement agreement, the department agreed to change the way it determines budgets for adults in the DD program. The purpose of this presentation is to give you an overview of that change as well as some other related changes the department is currently making. So over the course of this presentation today, we have organized the material we're going to cover based on the key steps for adults receiving adult DD services. As support brokers, I'm sure you are all very familiar with these steps, but just as a reminder, each and every year, a participant must begin with an assessment if they would like to continue receiving services from the program. After that assessment, they will receive a budget, and from that can develop their plan or their SSP before they begin receiving services. In some, but not all circumstances, individuals may want to make changes during the plan year and can do so if needed. There is one additional step that exists for initial applicants, which does not exist for existing participants, and that is the application process. And that's where we're going to start first. So there was one minor change that has been made to the application process in preparation to the move to the new budget model, as indicated by the arrow in blue here. These boxes have been slightly changed to now explain in more detail exactly what is meant by what services are you seeking. The choices are DD waiver traditional, DD waiver self-directed, and state plan HCBS services, which now detail all of the services that are available under the state plan, including service coordination, community rehabilitation, developmental therapy, and non-medical transportation. The application is what helps the independent assessment contractor, Liberty, to identify what path to follow when making an initial eligibility determination. It is important that applicants understand what each of these boxes truly mean and how it can impact what they are later deemed eligible for. Only those participants who apply for DD waiver services, and by that I mean either DD waiver traditional or DD waiver self-directed, can receive DD waiver services, even if they would otherwise qualify. What that means is that an applicant who may check a box for state plan HCBS services because maybe initially they're only seeking community rehabilitation supports, but in the future who may want to receive other services that are available on the waiver, may be inclined to go ahead and check the box for DD waiver services at their initial application, just to identify whether or not they are eligible to receive those DD waiver services. That does not require them to use the full host of DD waiver services initially. In fact, a participant in that boat can still choose to only receive that community rehabilitation service during their first plan year. But it makes the process of then adjusting in the future if, say, they wanted to add supports from a certified family home or would like to begin to self-direct their services, will make that process easier into the future because they've already identified that they are looking and able to seek those DD waiver services and are eligible to do so. So as just a quick reminder, HCBS state plan only applies for participants in one of three circumstances. The first are individuals who do not meet the requirements to receive DD waiver services. The second are individuals who do not apply to receive DD waiver services, as I just described. The third is those individuals who receive services through another waiver, like the A&D waiver, and as a result, may only access those HCBS state plan services. DD waiver applies for individuals who meet the requirements for ICF ID eligibility, and folks who are able to access the DD waiver can also receive those HCBS state plan services in addition to the DD waiver services. Individuals who meet the requirements and apply to receive the DD waiver can then choose between using traditional and self-directed options. Folks who choose traditional are then selecting an eligible provider to administer the services that they choose, and folks who select DD waiver, self-direction, allow for participants to independently hire their community support workers that they want to provide their service. By choosing self-direction, participants have some additional flexibility and choices in their services, but they also have a host of additional responsibilities. I'm going to pause quickly and see if we've got any questions that have come up yet before we get into the next step, which is talking about the assessment itself. All right. Not seeing any yet, so let's keep moving forward. So the first key step that applies to all participants each and every year is to get an assessment. This step is changing as a result of the move to the new budget model. The Vineland 3 is being used to replace the SIB-R for the purposes of identifying program eligibility and ICF ID level of care. The Supports Intensity Scale Adult, or CIS-A, is replacing the SIB-R and the Inventory of Needs to help determine annual budgets. The new budget model requires a valid and reliable assessment of support need, which is why the CIS-A was selected. It's also important to remember that the CIS-A was chosen not just by the department themselves, but by a work group that included both DHW staff as well as a host of external advocates. This tool was reviewed along with a host of other tools to help identify the tool that could best meet the requirements that the department has for such tools and that was most amenable to the desires of participants in being a more person-centered and positive assessment. These new assessment tools are set to go live on June 1st of this year, or upon approval from CMS, whichever is later. As you may be aware, the department is still currently in discussion with CMS about the waiver amendment and the 1915I plan amendments that are necessary to allow for these changes to go forward. The plan is to move forward on June 1st, but there remains the possibility that approval is not received by that date, which is why that date is still dependent upon CMS approval. If the date needs to change further from June 1st, you will be informed by the department of that as soon as they are aware. Another thing to be aware of with regard to the new assessments is the need to revise the assessment schedule. As you guys are well aware, typically participants only receive a full assessment about every 3 years. However, during implementation of this new model, all participants will receive a CIS-A and a Vineland 3 in just about 1 year. Participants will then need to be divided into 3 groups to determine when they will get their next full assessment, as the full assessment process is much more time-consuming and a lot more effort is involved on the part of the assessors. It is necessary to rejigger or reorganize the assessment schedule so that 1/3 of participants will receive those new assessments, will receive a full assessment every year. As a result, individuals have been divided into 3 groups, Group A, Group B, and Group C. As you can see on the chart here, all participants will receive a full assessment during implementation year, 22 to 23. Then 1/3 of individuals, so the folks in Group A, will then receive another full assessment in the subsequent year, 23 to 24. The other 2 groups, Group B and Group C, will just receive a focused review in those years, and only if there's been a major change in their needs will they then receive a full assessment. Folks in Group A will then receive 2 years of focused reviews, and then will get their next full assessment in 2026 to 2027. Folks in Group B will get a full assessment during this year, have 1 focused review, and then will get another full assessment in 2024 to 2025. They will then get back on the normal schedule and have a focused review for the 2 subsequent years, getting their next full assessment in 2027 to 2028. Folks who are members of Group C will get their full assessment during this implementation period, but then will have 2 years of focused reviews before getting their next full assessment in 2025 to 2026. This group, once they get their full assessment during implementation, will be on a pretty normal schedule and will have 2 years of focused reviews before they need another full assessment. Those participants who volunteered to participate in a practice CIS-A to help finalize the training of the assessors from Liberty will be automatically placed into Group C as a thank you measure, since they will have just received one CSA and will need to do another during the implementation period. It's important to also remember that participants who have a change in condition at any point during this rollout schedule will be adjusted and will instead receive a full assessment as soon as it is required. Any new participants will receive a full assessment on that regular 3-year cycle based on their application date and when they entered the program. Now let's talk in a little more detail about the new assessments, the first being the Vineland 3. The assessor and respondents will review and discuss adaptive behaviors in a series of areas within the Vineland 3, including communication, daily living skills, socialization, motor skills, and maladaptive behaviors. As you may remember, the Vineland 3 is being used for 2 purposes. 1, to help establish program eligibility, and 2, to help establish waiver eligibility. The first of these purposes is around, again, that program eligibility. In order for an adult to be eligible to receive services from the Adult DD program, that individual must be 18 years or older, must have a qualifying diagnosis that was made before the age of 22, and must have a substantial limitation in at least 3 major life activities. This is the piece of eligibility that is determined using the Vineland 3 once implementation begins. All adults who meet DD program eligibility are eligible to receive state plan HCBS services. For our purposes, program eligibility equals state plan HCBS eligibility. So how does the Vineland 3 identify if someone has a substantial limitation in 3 major life activities? This chart shows you exactly how that crosswalk happens to identify a substantial limitation from scores within the Vineland 3. In order to identify if a participant has a substantial limitation in, for example, the self-care major life activity, assessors will identify whether or not the participant has a V-scale score of less than or equal to 10 from the personal subdomain within the Vineland 3. If they do, then the participant has been identified as having a substantial limitation in one of those major life activities. As you look down this chart, you'll see the scores for each of the major life activity areas. Again, a participant needs to have a substantial limitation in at least 3 of these areas in order to be eligible for the program. For an individual to be eligible to receive the waiver services, they must meet ICF ID level of care. In order to meet ICF ID level of care, a participant must meet all of the DD program eligibility requirements, must require active treatment, and must meet 1 or more of the criteria that are detailed on this slide. They must meet either the functional requirements, the behavioral requirements, or a combination of the functional and behavioral requirements, or the medical requirements in order to meet ICF ID level of care. Again, all of these requirements are measured using the Vineland 3 moving forward. So for example, a participant who has an adaptive behavior composite score less than 55 would meet the functional requirements and therefore be ICF ID eligible so long as they were also eligible for the program and also met the need for active treatment. A participant would meet the behavioral requirements if they had a maladaptive internal or external score greater than or equal to 21, or if they had a maladaptive internal or external score less than 21 and they engaged in aggressive or self-injurious behaviors. Participants can be found eligible on a combination if they have an adaptive behavior composite score between a 55 and 70, and if they have a maladaptive internal or external score of 18 and 20. Folks can meet the medical requirements based on their medical conditions, so long as it significantly affects their functional level and capabilities. Individuals who apply for waiver services and meet the ICF ID level of care requirements are therefore eligible to receive waiver services and can then select whether to receive those services using traditional or self-direction. Now let's talk a little bit about the CysA. Who attends the CysA interview? The adult with intellectual developmental disabilities is always invited and encouraged to take part in the interview. However, if someone does not want to, they are not required to do so. The CysA does require at least 2 people who know the adult well and understand his or her support needs to be present for the entire interview. It is the adult's choice who takes part in that CysA interview. The CysA has 3 overarching areas. Section 1 around exceptional medical and behavioral support needs, Section 2 called the Support Needs Index, and Section 3 around protection and advocacy called the Protection and Advocacy Scale. Only some components of the CysA are used to help determine a participant's support level. Those include Section 2A Home Living, 2B Community Living, and 2E Health and Safety Activities. Section 1 of the CYS, around exceptional medical and behavioral support needs, is used along with the supplemental questions to help identify individuals who may meet the requirements for level M, for those with extraordinary medical, or level B, individuals with extraordinary behavioral support needs, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. Before we dig into exactly how we get to a support level, I want to pause again and see if any questions have come through.
So Elena, this is Michael. We have had one question come through the chat asking, is there a navigator for the new individuals into the program? So in our current process, our quality assurance staff can assist individuals with understanding the different pathways, understanding the program options available, and understanding the application process. And those staff exist in each region to assist individuals as they're coming into the program. That process will continue in the new system.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions? And folks can also feel free to raise their hand using the button on their screen, and you can be unmuted to ask your question verbally.
I'm not seeing any additional questions or raised hands at this point.
All right, well, let's keep going. So how does a participant get a support level? Each participant is assigned to only one support level within the new model. Levels 1 through 3 are assigned based on an individual's CysA scores, as I just described. Level 1 is for participants who have relatively low support needs and have a standard score of between 8 and 22 on sections 2A, 2B, and 2E of the CysA. Level 2 is for participants who have moderate support needs. Those individuals have a standard score on sections 2A, 2B, and 2E between 23 and 30. Level 3 is for participants who have high general support needs. These are folks who have a standard score of between 31 and 52 on sections 2A, 2B, and 2E of the CysA. Levels M and B are assigned based on verified need. We'll describe exactly what that process looks like in just a moment, but it's important to know that just because a participant has a certain some ABE score does not necessarily mean that that is the level they will be placed into. For example, Michael could have a standard score on sections 2A, 2B, and 2E of 29. However, if Michael also has an extraordinary medical support need that would place him into level M or to meet the requirements for level M, even despite meeting the criteria for level 2, he would be placed into level M because each participant is assigned to only one support level. It's also possible that a participant may meet the criteria for both levels M and B. If that is the case, then they will be assigned to the level that the verification review team determines as the primary driver of their extraordinary support need. Let's talk a little bit more about how folks are assigned to levels M or B. All participants are eligible to request consideration for levels M or B. This process is going to be known as verification review and is very similar to the current intense review process that some participants may have engaged in. Participants will be asked during the assessment if they believe that they meet the criteria for level M or B and whether they would like to pursue verification review. If the participant would like to pursue verification, they will be given the information necessary to do so, including the verification questionnaire and a guide around what kinds of documentation they would need to submit. Just as a reminder, here is the criteria for assignment into level M. I'll note that this IDAPA citation is relevant for the forthcoming rule set and not yet accurate. So until the new rules are published, I would not recommend utilizing this citation to go and try to find this rule. But as soon as the rules go live, this will be an accurate citation. So to meet the criteria for level M, a participant must have a chronic or acute medical condition, which is complex, unstable, or both. They need to require one-to-one staffing to provide frequent intervention and constant monitoring for all or a substantial portion of the day. And without such intervention and monitoring, that person would require placement in a nursing facility, hospital, or ICF ID. This slide details the criteria for being assigned to level B. Again, the citation that will be relevant for that criteria is provided here. This is seemingly more complex as there are many more pathways that a participant may potentially get into level B, but a lot of the basics remain the same. In order to be assigned to level B, a participant must require one-to-one staffing to provide frequent intervention and constant monitoring for at least 16 hours a day in order to prevent the behavior that is of concern. This could be related to having a pending felony charge related to serious injury or harm of another person, having been placed on probation within the previous 3 years for a felony conviction related to the serious injury or harm of another person, having been paroled within the preceding 3 years from incarceration for a felony conviction related to serious injury or harm of another person, having been released for time served from incarceration for a felony conviction related to the serious injury or harm of another, having a pending felony charge, misdemeanor, or a felony conviction related to predatory sexual offense, or exhibiting any behavior of a nature which could result in such charges, and being at a high risk to reoffend based on a sexual offender risk assessment, as well as having a history of serious aggressive behavior, which includes a documented sustained history of such behavior, either causing harm to themselves or others. I previously described the process known as flagging, which happens as a result of responses to Section 1 of the Csws and the supplemental questions. All that flagging means is that this participant has been identified as perhaps being more likely to meet the criteria for level M or level B. A participant is flagged for level M if they have a response of 1 to 1 or more items in Section 1A, respond yes to the supplemental medical question, and identify that they need 84 support hours per week or more for extraordinary medical support. Individuals are flagged for level B if they have a response of 1 to 1 or more items in Section 1B of the Csws, a response of yes to the supplemental behavioral question, and have identified a need of 84 support hours per week for extraordinary behavior support. A participant can also be flagged for a combination of M and B. This requires that they answer at least 1 to at least 1 item in both Section 1A and 1B, have a response of yes to both supplemental questions, And in total, between the two supplemental questions, identify a need of 84 hours or more of combined support for that medical and behavioral need. Participants who flag for verification can still decline to go through the verification review process if they do not wish to do so. Individuals who request verification will be provided with a new verification questionnaire and be told to submit that questionnaire along with any supporting documentation within 14 days of the assessment. Individuals can also request verification at any point during the plan year, although it is highly recommended that participants make that request at the point of their assessment. Any participants who do not request verification will be assigned to levels 1, 2, or 3 based on their Csws scores. This slide provides a few examples of the kinds of documentation that can be submitted to help support a request for level M or level B. For level M, such kinds of documentation could include progress notes from a primary care physician, emergency room reports, fully notated seizure logs, diagnostic reports, nursing plans, or hospital discharge summaries. Documentation that may be applicable for a participant seeking level B could include court orders, a sexual risk assessment, incident reports, police reports, behavior management plans, or other legal documents. The Verification Review Team, or VRT, includes a variety of individuals, including members that fill all of these roles: a clinically licensed behavioral health professional, a representative from BEADS Quality Assurance, a representative who is a BEADS care manager, a licensed practical or registered nurse, a representative from the FACTS Crisis Prevention Team, a qualified intellectual disabilities professional, as well as an administrative member. The VRT determines if a participant meets any of the criteria for level M or B using the verification questionnaire, those supporting documents that have been submitted, and any records that are maintained by the department. A participant's eligibility and budget notice will include information on the VRT's decision, the rationale for that decision, and the documents that they reviewed to make such a decision. Participants do have the right to appeal decisions by the Verification Review Team. Any questions before we move on to talking about how a participant selects a service mix?
So we have had a couple questions come through. The first being is, if only 3 sections are used, could the CSA be abbreviated for the first year in order to get them all done?
I can start with that question. I'll let you add in anything you'd like, Michael. The purpose of completing the entire CSA is to help with planning purposes, and because over the course of the first year, we'll be doing an evaluation. That evaluation may include looking at whether or not there's any desire to adjust in the future the sections of the CSA that may be utilized in order to assign levels. And as a result, we want to be sure that we have as much information as possible to help support that evaluation process and to support the planning process for teams.
I would agree with that, and also to ensure that we're meeting any requirements that AAIDD might have for the utilization of the tool. And the second question that's come through is, I'm always asked as a support broker, will the participants' budgets stay where they currently are now because of the KW is still in place for another 2 years? You want to start with that, Alina? Do you want
I
me
can
to?
start with that, and I will say that is a really good question, and I promise we will cover that content a little bit later in this presentation. The short answer is, to the best of our knowledge, for the time being, participants will continue to have access to the budgets they currently have access to as a result of the American Rescue Plan, which we'll talk about a little later in this presentation. But at least for now, we anticipate that participants will continue to have access to their current budgets, as well as having the information and having the advisory budget of the new budgets as indicated within the new model.
Thank you. And then there was a question that came to me privately, indicating that I was told that we would get credit for attending these 2 trainings. How do we go about getting a certificate for proof of attendance? So we are able to track and have the attendance logged because of the way the WebEx events is set up. We will utilize that log to verify training when someone submits for utilizing this as training for their support broker certificate. So we will track that on our end. All you have to do is indicate that you attended, and we can verify that with the attendance list. And those are the only questions that I'm seeing. And I am not seeing any raised hands at this point.
All right. So we just went through how a person gets to their support level. We now need to talk about another component known as their service mix. A service mix is simply a term that we use to group participants based on the way they choose to receive their supports, meaning whether they choose traditional or self-direct, and the type of residential supports that they want to receive. Participants have the right to change their service mix at any time, with only one exception, and that is those participants who have a state plan HCBS only service mix can only change that service mix by receiving their DD waiver eligibility. What that means is that a participant who is only eligible for state plan HCBS only could only move to a different service mix if they were deemed to meet the ICF ID level of care requirements. For participants who self-direct, there are 3 service mixes that apply. The first is SD live-in supports, which is relevant for participants who receive in-home habilitation from a CSW that they live with. SD community-only supports for those participants who choose to receive no in-home habilitative supports, and SD outside supports for those participants who self-direct and who receive their in-home habilitation from CSWs that they do not live with. In order to help participants identify which service mix is applicable to them, the department has developed the following decision tree specifically for folks who self-direct. The assessor will be asked to walk respondents through these questions in order to arrive at the applicable service mix. The first question is, do you receive paid supports in your home? Yes or no? If no, then the participant would be directed to the self-directed community-only support service mix. If yes, a second question is asked, which is, does the person providing your in-home paid supports live in your home? If no, then self-directed outside supports is the applicable service mix. And if yes, then self-directed live-in supports is the applicable service mix. Some questions have come up about what happens when a participant has a combination of these. So for example, they have 2 CSWs, one who they live with and one who they do not, both who provide in-home supports. If in that circumstance, because at least one of the community support workers who provides in-home habilitation support lives with the person receiving services, they would receive the self-directed live-in support service mix, as that is what follows from the yes, the person providing supports does in fact live with the person who is receiving those. So once the participant's support level and service mix are determined, we now are ready to determine their budget. Each support level and service mix combination has its own model mix. In addition to the budget, which is determined using the model mix, a participant can also get services beyond that assigned budget using one of 3 types of budget modifications: a health or safety service request, a health or safety budget modification request, or an employment-related service request. We will talk about all kinds of budget modifications during this presentation. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about what exactly our model mix is. A model mix was developed by identifying the average type and amount of services DHW anticipates and individuals will use within each support level. Model mixes are used to price out and determine the exact budgets. However, participants are not required to use the specific services that are included in the model mix. It is simply the method by which the budget was arrived at. Model mixes can also be altered as needed based on changing factors like new rates coming into play, or as the result of an evaluation which shows that one of the services in the mix maybe is not utilized as often as the department anticipated. During the implementation year, the department will be doing an evaluation, and it is possible that model mixes may be changed in the future. In fact, the model mixes were very recently changed as a result of some new rates that are going to be coming into play based on additional funding that was approved by the legislature. Because of the way the new model is developed, we were simply able to go into the model mixes, adjust the rates to reflect the new rates which will be in effect once we begin the new model, and the budgets were therefore adjusted accordingly. Adults who self-direct will receive budgets that are based on the service mixes that were developed for adults in the traditional pathway. One major difference is that traditional budgets are divided into 3 components, while self-directed budgets are not. Self-directed community-only support service mix will receive a budget that is based on the model mix that was developed for community-only under the traditional model. Participants who receive the self-directed live-in support service mix have a model mix which is based loosely on the certified family home model mix under traditional. And participants who receive the self-directed outside support service mix have a model mix which is based on the supported living model mix in traditional with some minor adjustments. For all self-directed mixes, there is the addition that is added for the cost of FEA services, since that is specific to self-direction. One additional change is made between traditional and self-direction, and that is with regard to the self-directed outside supports mix. Some of the overhead costs associated with an supported living agency were removed from the self-directed outside supports mix, as we'll talk about and show you in just a minute as we walk through the model mixes. So just as a quick reminder, there are 3 components on traditional for the budgets. The first component is residential supports. The second component is discretionary supports. And the third component is planning supports. These 3 components together equal the total support budget. For self-direction, these 3 components are all mixed together as one, and participants may use the entire budget as they see fit, other than needing to hold out the cost associated with the FEA service, as that is a dedicated cost. Participants, both those who use traditional and those who self-direct, also have the ability to get those health, safety supports and employment supports above and beyond their budget. So in order to come to the model mixes, the department looked at the entire service array under traditional and identified which services fell into each of the components: residential, discretionary, service coordination, and planning. Here you'll see the entire list of health, safety, and employment services on traditional, which are held out from the mixes and can be obtained by simply meeting the service-specific requirements for those individual services. As I already discussed, the major difference is that for self-direction, the entire budget can be flexibly used without subcomponents. Here, as you can see, a variety of supports for self-direction, including personal support, learning support, emotional, relationship, and transportation support, as well as support broker services, all come out of the residential discretionary and planning supports budget. Some services, including job supports, adaptive equipment, and specialized nursing services, will be made available on top of that budget, as they are identified as health, safety, and employment services. So in order to dig into and understand the model mixes, I'm going to start by describing the traditional mix for community only. I realize that this may be a little bit hard to read on your screens. I'm just going to give you a quick overview, and then we'll dig in a little bit deeper for just one level. So across the left-hand side, you see the different components of the traditional budget: residential, discretionary, planning. You then see the different services that are applicable in each of these components, as well as the applicable rate. These mixes were recently updated to account for changes in the rates that are expected for certain services, including supported living, developmental therapy, and adult day health. The mixes are developed by identifying the number of hours, on average, that the department identified participants in a given level and service mix would typically use of a given service. That information is then added together to come to a dollar figure. All of these dollar figures are added up to get to the overall budget where the participant can then flexibly use. In hopes of making this a little bit easier to read, I've snipped out just the discretionary budget component for level 1 for participants in the traditional community-only mix. Here you can see that for a service adult day health, which has a rate of $2.79 for every 15 minutes, the department identified about 4 hours a week, which had a total cost over the course of a year of $2,232. Developmental therapy, center-based, has an anticipated rate of $4.17 for every 15 minutes, with 5 hours per week being included. You continue down the line, you can see how many hours per week were included in the mix, as well as the rate that is applicable, which comes to now the subtotal for the entire discretionary portion of the budget for traditional community only. Again, still looking at traditional, here is the total for each of the different components of the budget for a participant receiving traditional community only. Because the person receives no in-home paid residential supports, there are no dollars associated with that portion. As we just detailed, the discretionary budget had a total of just under $28,000. Planning budget included 2 components: plan development and service coordination, with a total of just under $3,200, and the total of all 3 equaled $31,147.16. So now, how does that convert to self-direction? Here you can see that the traditional component for residential support was included. There was no dollars associated that we just described. And so for the self-direction component, there were $0 associated. The exact same figure was ported over from the discretionary budget to the self-directed. So that adds just under $28,000 to the budget. The entire planning budget from traditional was ported over at just under $3,200, but the additional FEA cost was added of $1,296. When you add together each of the subtotal for the residential section, discretionary, and planning section, you then have a total of $32,443.16. Participants in self-direction will receive a notice that simply has the total figure at the below here, as their budgets are not divided into the subcomponents that traditional are, but they may utilize these dollars flexibly to purchase those self-directed services that they believe are most applicable for them. This slide offers an overview not just of level 1, but of each of the support levels for SD community-only supports. As you can see, as support levels go up, the budgets increase. And we have some additional slides that detail the traditional certified family home mix, the self-directed live-in supports mix, the traditional supported living mix, and the self-directed outside supports mix. I want to stop for just a moment on this mix, as this is slightly different than the others. In addition to just picking up the traditional component for residential, discretionary, and planning, an additional step is had for this service mix, in which some of the overhead costs for a supported living agency have been removed. As you can see in this line item, that's noted in parentheses, and the reduced total from the traditional component. Again, here, we still add in the cost of FEA, and then add together the three components, residential, discretionary, and planning, to get to the SD budget. Again, these increase level by level. In level 1 for self-directed outside supports, that equals just over $107,000, while for levels M or B, that equals just over $229,000. I know we went through these model mixes very quickly. Because we have so much content to get through today, and because I know these slides are not particularly readable, we will be making the mixes available on the My Choice Matters website for people to be able to look at and zoom in on their screens as they see fit. And we are more than happy to answer additional questions at a later time specific to the mixes themselves. Before we dig into the budget modification options, I want to pause and ask for questions on the overview of the model mixes and the service mixes.
So we've had a couple of questions that have come in, Alina. The first, what about participants live in their own apartment but do not have anyone specifically living with them, and they obviously are not a CFH?
So a participant who is living alone or who is not in a CFH but has maybe community support workers who come into their home to help support them and provide some in-home supports would receive the outside support service mix. A participant who was living independently and perhaps was only receiving supports outside of their home, so to get out in the community or do those kinds of activities, would receive the community-only mix. We know there are also circumstances where a participant may not live in a certified family home, but may live with a roommate, but they may be the owner of the dwelling. If that roommate is a CSW, provides some of their in-home supports, then they would receive the live-in supports mix. Whereas if that roommate did not receive or provide any paid supports, but they did have other CSWs coming into their home, they would receive the outside supports mix.
So similar, and I think you've covered this with that. For live-in supports but non-CFH, can we use the health and safety forms to request more CSW hours than the budget will allow?
Yes, absolutely. And we'll be discussing budget modifications here in just a moment, but health and safety forms are absolutely available and encouraged if a participant has a health or a safety reason that they need supports beyond what the budget will afford.
Can individuals on SD use some of their planning budget that is not used for other supports?
Yes, participants on SD, because their budget is one comprehensive budget, the only limitation is that those dollars which are allocated to FEA must be used for that purpose. But the rest of the budget may be used flexibly for any of those supports that they see fit, including their support broker services, but other kinds of services as well.
I have no additional questions or hands raised, but I do have one comment that was made. Person feeling there is still a huge bias based on whom a participant chooses to hire for in-home support. So we will log that comment.
So in addition to the services that a participant may get using their budget, there is also the opportunity to obtain services and supports beyond the budget using budget modifications. The first of those possibilities is obtaining services which are identified as health, safety, or employment services. On the screen, you will see a screenshot of a sheet that will be included in all of the budget notices once we move into the implementation of the new model. And this sheet details exactly the name of the service that is identified as a health, safety, or employment service, as well as the service-specific criteria to use that service. We will talk about this in more detail a little later in the presentation, but just as a reminder, there are a series of services that are specifically identified and designated as health and safety services, as well as services that are specifically designated as employment services, which can be accessed above the budget by simply meeting the service-specific criteria. In addition to the health, safety, and employment services, there remains the ability to request a budget modification for a health or a safety risk. Participants can make that request by submitting a health risk form or a safety risk form, and by providing documentation such as the examples listed here as to why the participant has a health or a safety risk which would require dollars in addition to the budget. The health risk form and safety risk form will be included in all budget notices as we move into the new model to make them easily accessible to participants and support brokers to complete as needed. When submitting health or safety risk forms, care managers will reach out to plan developers or support brokers for clarification or to ask additional questions if the budget modification request and documentation fail to show the following. For health risks, they must show the health risk to the participant without the requested service, the specific service that is being requested to address the health risk, how the requested service will address the health risk, and must provide documentation that is from a licensed professional within the scope of their practice. For safety risks, the documentation and budget modification request need to include the imminent or likely safety risk, the specific service that's being requested to address that risk, how the requested service will address the risk, as well as documentation provided from a licensed professional within the scope of their practice. There is also the possibility that a budget modification request may be better suited for a different process. If that is the case, the care manager will contact the plan developer or support broker and request that they submit the documentation for that process instead. Two possible processes which may be requested instead of a budget modification include a change in condition. That would be when a participant's need has changed since their most recent assessment. And as a result, the request for what they're receiving is insufficient, or if someone is identifying a need that is equivalent to those associated with levels M or B and chose not to seek verification at the time of the assessment, but would now like to receive that level of support. In either of those circumstances, a budget modification may not be the best course of action, and the care manager will help direct the support broker and participant to the appropriate process. As we've already described, participants' budgets can also be modified to access those health, safety, and employment services by adding those to the SSP and providing the required documentation. No specific form is needed to request those services. Those services are simply added to the costing sheet along with the documentation to show that the participant meets the requirements for that service. Chapter 12 of the Self-Direction Manual will provide the details around these service-specific criteria once it is out and available. Care managers will approve health, safety, and employment services when the required documentation submitted with the plan shows the need for that service. One additional note on budget modifications specific to self-direction is that a participant may access transportation support services beyond what their assigned budget will allow for without a health risk or safety risk when those transportation supports are for competitive community employment. While the TSS code will be deducted from the participant's budget, in this circumstance, it would be considered an applicable employment service. Support brokers will need to identify the portion of the TSS that is specific to employment and submit a mileage reimbursement for integrated employment request form to explain why the plan is over budget related to that employment-related TSS. More information about that form will be available in part 2 of this training. I'm going to get through just a couple more slides before we take a quick break, and that is to discuss the possible impact of the public health emergency and the American Rescue Plan. Because of COVID-19, we are still under a federal public health emergency, and we don't know when that will end. The federal government also provided states with extra money to provide supports and services due to the public health emergency through the American Rescue Plan. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid put in place special rules because of the public health emergency, and they also said that states can only keep the money from the American Rescue Plan if they take certain actions. As a result of all of these rules, things are going to be a little bit different when we start using the budget model than how we initially anticipated. The rules around ARP essentially say 3 things. The first is that a state cannot make it any harder to be found eligible for services than it was on April 1st, 2021. The second is that people must be able to keep getting the amount and type of services they were able to get on April 1st, 2021. And provider rates cannot go lower than they were on April 1st, 2021. The department is still in discussions with CMS about exactly how this will impact implementation, but for now, the department thinks it means 3 things. The first is that everyone who is currently eligible for the DD program will remain eligible. Second, that any new applicants who are found ineligible using the Vineland 3 will have a chance to be assessed with the SIB-R to see if they meet the eligibility requirements that were in place on April 1st, 2021, and that participants will have access to their current budget until all of the ARP requirements are met. That is currently projected to end in March of 2024. As a result of the American Rescue Plan, budget notices will look a little bit different because they will need to include both the budget determined using the new model and the highest budget assigned between April 1st, 2021 and the implementation of that new model. So as a result, budgets determined using the new model will be described as advisory budgets. The notice will say your advisory budget for the upcoming plan year is X amount based on your assigned service mix and support level. It will then state that your ARP budget is X amount. This amount reflects your highest budget you were assigned between April 1st, 2021 and May 1st, 2022. Therefore, your assigned budget for the upcoming plan year is, and that number will be the higher of the 2. For some participants, the advisory budget may be higher than the budget they had under KW or between April 1st, 2021 and the implementation of the new model. And as a result, the advisory budget number would be on this line. Other participants may have had a higher budget using their ARP budget, and as a result, that is the budget that will be included on this line. One last slide before we break, and that is to simply review that the new eligibility and budget notices are going to look a little different than those notices you may have seen in the past. Under the new model, we've adjusted the budget notices to include a number of sections and have identified specific attachments related to each section to help participants and their support people understand the new model and exactly how their budgets were determined. The first section is around eligibility, and there will be an attachment which includes the participants' Vineland scores. The second section is around the person's budget decision. It will include an attachment that details exactly how support levels are decided. It will also include the person's CysA results, as well as an attachment that explains how the budget was decided and will include the applicable model mix for that participant. If a participant requests verification, they will receive their verification decision in their budget notice. There's also a section just around budget modifications, which include the health and safety forms, as well as the list of health, safety, and employment services. A section on how to submit a plan of service, which will vary for initial participants versus participants who've been in the program for some time. And a section just about appeal rights, which will include the form necessary to request an appeal. With that, I will pause for questions, and once we cover those questions, we'll take a break before we talk about developing the plan.
So my apologies, we had a hand raised and for some reason I was not able to see it on the screen here, but they put their question in the chat. And so Tiffany, I do apologize. The question is, there's a cap on support broker at $18.72 per hour. The comparison to plan developer and service coordinator pay is more than double with less responsibility. Please, when will the cap and the pay per hour increase? It has not changed or been increased since the start of the self-direction program in 2008. And so I guess that's one actually for me more to address. And support brokers are correct. There is a cap on what can be charged to a participant, and that rate can be negotiated with the participant. This actually came up yesterday as well on the provider call, and we will take this back and begin that evaluation process within the department on that cap. The next question, will the department be sending out hard copies of the updated self-directed and support broker manuals? On this one, I do not believe we will be sending out hard copies, but we'll make the manual available to people online to be able to access, and it should be downloadable and printable if that is how you choose to access the manual. So it will be posted on our website as well as the My Choice Matters website. The next question is, will a new support broker manual be produced with all of this new information and forms? The answer there is yes. That manual is in the finalization process now and will be made available as soon as we are able to do so. We have a question about the inventory of individual needs, asking if it will continue to be used. The inventory of individual needs was a form that, or is a form that is utilized to feed the current budget tool. Since that budget tool will no longer be utilized, that form will no longer be needed. Demographic information and certain information that's gathered on that form will be gathered in other ways. Alina, is there any additional input on that one?
Nope, that's correct.
And then the final question that I have in the chat is, will individuals continue to receive an MSDA? And I believe our answer to that is yes, that the MSDA will continue to be utilized and update individuals' medical needs and information there.
Yes, so the assessment process moving forward will include the completion of the Vineland 3, the Csws, and the MSDA. All three of those components together will happen during the assessment process.
We have a question about the final question that I'm seeing here. If provider rates cannot be decreased below April 21st, does that mean CSW rates cannot be decreased? And Alina, you can correct me if I am wrong here. There's a difference between provider rates. The provider rates are what the department reimburses a Medicaid enrolled provider. CSW rates are negotiated by the participant with their CSW. So those rates can change, which could mean going down. I don't know that I would anticipate that happening, but that is theoretically possible. But the provider rates are those rates that the department reimburses Medicaid enrolled providers.
That is my understanding as well.
And I'm going to scan one more time to ensure that there are no raised hands. And I'm not seeing any, but now I'm a little paranoid that the contrast is not huge on this. And if I could be so imposed, Tiffany, you had raised your hand before. Could you raise it one more time just so that I can sure how it's looking on the screen so that I'm not missing something?
Doesn't show.
She might not be hearing me. Okay. I'll have some of my other staff monitoring for that too, just to make sure we're not missing anything. One last question's come through. How long is the initial assessment process estimated to be?
Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but at current estimates, I believe they're anticipating approximately 3 hours. Is that accurate?
Correct. It could be a little longer, but they are anticipating 3 hours as the average. And they're also anticipating that as people get used to the new process, that time could decrease.
And just for clarification, we identify it's the Vineland 3, the Csws, and the Msda. So the completion of all three of those components together, which equals the entire assessment meeting. And that the average is around 3 hours for the combination as being reported, I believe, at the current time from Liberty.
Correct. It is the combination of the Cis-A and the Vineland.
With that, why don't we break for 5 minutes, give people a chance to stretch their legs, maybe get a drink of water, and we will reconvene at, either 2:18 or 3:18, depending on your time zone, and start talking about the next step, which is plan development. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? So now that we've gotten through the assessment, how a participant gets their budget, including how they can adjust the budget using the variety of budget modification processes, now we move into how we develop a plan. The costing sheet portion of service plan development is going to change quite a bit with the new budget model. This is the result of more services to choose from, reduction in the service-specific sublimits, as well as some additional flexibility between budget components. Issues around the development of plans, the SSP, as well as the costing sheets will all be covered in part 2 of this training. So just so you know, we are not forgetting that component. We'll have a whole other training specifically on that topic. Once a person develops their plan, it gets approved, they move into getting services. And oftentimes, that's when they don't need to hear from us again. But in some circumstances, a participant may identify that they need to make changes at some point during the plan year. And as a result, they may need to go back to the plan development process. There is a new concept under the new model known as mid-year plans. What this is referring to is the need to truly develop a new plan due to a change in either the participant's level or service mix. Mid-year plans are necessary for participants who have a change in condition and as a result are assigned to a new level. As a result, they will receive a new prorated budget and will have to develop a new plan. Similarly, participants who have a service mix change will need to receive a new prorated budget and will also have to develop a new plan because their budget is changing along with that service mix change. The third type of mid-year plan is the result of a participant who declined to go through verification at the time of the assessment, but later decides to go through that process. If they are assigned to levels M or B as a result of verification, then they will need to develop a new plan, also with a prorated budget for the remainder of their plan year. Plan changes can still happen outside of mid-year plans. These will simply be limited to changes in how those dollars are allocated for participants who are still within the same level and the same service mix. So the first type of mid-year plan results from a change in condition. Participants can request a new assessment if there has been a change in their condition that results in the most recent assessment no longer being accurate. If a change in condition is requested, the plan developer will need to complete the change in condition request form and detail exactly what changes occurred. You'll also need to submit supporting documentation showing how the individual's condition has changed. Liberty will then review that request and determine if the information submitted supports a new assessment. If a change in condition request is approved, Liberty will contact the individual and/or the support team to schedule a new set of assessments. After the assessment has been completed, Liberty will send out a new budget notice. If the change in condition results in a new support level, then the plan developer will need to submit a new plan that will be prorated for the rest of the plan year. If the change in condition does not result in a new support level, then a new plan does not need to be submitted. Here is a copy of the change in condition request form. Along the top, basic contact information, a need to describe the condition that has changed, a list of the documents that are being submitted to detail and explain the need for the change in condition, as well as a signature by the participant and their guardian if applicable. This form can be submitted to the information coordinator at the department. If a participant has not had a change in their condition, but their selected service mix no longer describes their situation, then it is a service mix change request that will need to be submitted to the information coordinator. Note that a service mix change request can be utilized both when a participant changes in their living situation, so for example, someone who's currently receiving SD community-only supports, but decides to start receiving supports from a CSW who comes into their home, and so is now needing to move to SD outside supports, as well as participants who choose to move between waiver options, so someone who is in self-direction and decides to move to traditional or vice versa. Liberty will need to determine whether all of the necessary information has been received and whether the participant has a CysA on file. If a CysA has already been completed, then a service mix change can be completed simply using a file review. If there is not a CysA yet, the participant will need to be scheduled for a full assessment, including the Vineland 3, the CysA, and the Msda. Once that new assessment has been completed, Liberty will mail out a budget notice to the participant and/or the guardian, and a prorated plan will need to be submitted to align with the participant's needs and situation. This is a new form, which will go into effect with the beginning of the new model, which details the service mix change request. Again, basic contact information across the top, an identification whether or not the participant has received a CysA, identification of which service mix currently applies for the participant, as well as what service mix is being requested. Now, we understand that service mix is a new terminology, and so that may not be automatically understandable for a participant who's looking to make a change who has not yet moved into the new model. We ask that support brokers assist participants in understanding which service mix is likely applicable based on the current model if they're making a request during implementation year and don't yet know which service mix applies. So for example, a participant who currently receives self-directed supports but doesn't receive any support in their home, the currently assigned service mix would be SD community-only supports, even though that's not necessarily a term that would automatically make sense to the person within the current model. When identifying what the requested service mix is, you know that this participant is hoping to move into a situation in which they start hiring CSWs who live outside of their home to start coming into their home to provide those services. Well, then the requested service mix would be SD outside supports, and that is the box that would be checked. The participant and the guardian also sign this form, and it is also submitted to the information coordinator. The last type of mid-year plan we want to discuss is those off-cycle verification requests. Now, participants are allowed to request a verification at any time. However, as we already noted, it's highly recommended that participants go ahead and make that request at the assessment if they believe they meet the criteria for level M or B. If a request is made more than 30 days after the assessment, Liberty will contact the participant to inquire if there has been a change in that participant's needs. If the request for verification is due to a change, then the participant will be directed to complete the change in condition request, as that is the appropriate request for that circumstance. If there has not been a change in the participant's needs, the participant simply is now wanting to request verification and believe that they have always met the criteria for level M or B, then Liberty will send a notice requesting supporting documentation and a copy of the verification questionnaire. If the verification review team finds that that person is eligible for levels M or B, then they will receive a notice with a new budget, and they will need to prepare and submit a new prorated plan. If the verification team finds the participant is not eligible for level M or B, they will get a notice with the VRT's decision, but they can keep their current service plan as the level to which they are already assigned would be applicable. Before we get into service-specific information and criteria for the remainder of our training today, I'm going to pause and see if any questions have come up.
I am not seeing any new questions, and I think I fixed the ability to be able to see raised hands. I do not see any raised hands at the moment. Oh, one question just came in. Are exception reviews still available?
Exception reviews are now being known as budget modifications for health or safety risks, but the basic components remain the same. You complete a health risk form or a safety risk form, submit that along with the plan, and it will be evaluated to determine if a reason exists to go above and beyond the participant's budget for a health risk or a safety risk.
Let's see. I see one that says, how long will these change requests take?
So the amount of time to process change requests is going to vary depending on the kind of change that it is. So a change in condition request will be processed, but in the event that it is approved, it would then be necessary to complete a new host of assessments, get those scheduled, convene the team in order to complete the assessments, in order to then process that request. A service mix change request can be done relatively expeditiously if a participant already has a Csws on file. However, for a participant who's not yet received a Csws, a new assessment would have to be completed once we begin implementation in order to complete the service mix change request, which would increase the amount of time necessary to complete that request. I realize that answer did not give any hard timelines, and I don't know if you can give any specific timelines beyond that, Michael, at this point.
I can't, I apologize. We have another question. As far as those participants who have already received their SD budgets, and this going into effect 6/1, will they just wait until their next appointment with Liberty? So, so yes, budget plans will continue on until their next annual, to the month of their annual assessment, that their annual assessment would normally occur, at which point they'll go into the new system. The individuals' prior authorizations will be converted to be accessed in the new system. But as far as the budget, that change will not occur until they receive the new assessment in the same month that their annual assessment would be due. Or if they have a change of condition that occurs and they need to submit a change of condition after implementation, they will get a new assessment at that point.
So at this point, we anticipate that participants who are set to receive assessments in the month of June will be the first participants who are moving into the new model. Again, assuming that we receive approval from CMS by that date, which is still to be determined. But as currently planned, individuals who will begin receiving the new assessments in June for plans that then follow subsequently.
Let's see, during the remainder of an individual's current plan, will they need to follow the new system changes? So am I understanding that to mean, can they access the new services? Or
So I believe, and Penny, correct me if I'm wrong, that this question is regarding whether or not someone needs to begin using new forms, new things of that nature, as there are not specific new services applicable in self-direction. And what we would identify is that participants who are currently on the old model, if they needed to make a plan change that would not impact major things. So if they needed to change, for example, from personal support to learning support, but we're simply moving dollars around. They could continue to do that on the old forms in the old system, but that if a participant were to request a change in condition, they would need to use the new form to do that. If they were to change, for example, to want to move out of self-direction and into traditional, then they would need to use the new service mix change request to do that, because either of those actions would expedite their movement into the new model based on that change going forward. All right. Not seeing any other questions.
I'm not seeing any hands.
Okay. Then let's move forward with talking about some of the service-specific information and criteria. Again, none of the services specific to self-direction are changing as a result of the implementation of the new model, but we're just taking this opportunity to discuss and review some of the criteria associated with current services, as well as the criteria for those services which can be accessed above and beyond the budget because they have been deemed health services, safety services, or employment services. So again, as a reminder, there are 3 service codes or subcodes within self-direction that have been identified as being health, safety, and employment services. That's job support, adaptive equipment, and specialized nursing services. All of the other codes are identified as coming out of the participant's budget, which is a combination of the residential discretionary and planning supports budget that they can use flexibly. For participants who are in the live-in support service mix, this is identified for those participants who either reside in a certified family home and receive supports in that home and in the community, or who receive in-home habilitation from a CSW that they live with. It's intended that individuals in this service mix will learn independent living skills and receive supervision as necessary. And if they are residing in a certified family home, that certified family home provider is a community support worker who is paid at an hourly negotiable rate up to the reasonable alternative, which for comparable services. If a participant is residing in a certified family home, alone time must be requested on the SSP or a plan change, or can be requested using a CFH alone time request form if that is the only change that needs to be requested. Participants who are in an outside support service mix are receiving in-home services provided by a CSW that do not reside with them. They can also receive services in the community and also are attempting to learn independent living skills and receive supervision as necessary. These participants may live with or without roommates, and their CSWs are paid at an hourly negotiable rate up to the reasonable alternative to which for comparable services. Outside supports are based on that supported living service model mix minus some of the overhead costs associated with the supported living agency. The community-only supports service mix is for self-directed participants who choose to receive no in-home habilitative support. It's important to remember that participants in all service mixes who self-direct can receive and should receive community support services. It is simply that for participants who choose not to receive in-home services, the community-only service mix is applicable. Residential and discretionary supports are provided by community support workers in each of the following categories. That includes personal support services to help the employer maintain their health, safety, and basic quality of life, learning support services to help the employer learn new skills and improve existing skills related to their goals, emotional supports to help the employer learn and practice behaviors consistent with their goals while minimizing interfering behaviors, relationship support services, which are intended to help the employer establish and maintain positive relationships with family members, friends, and others in order to build a natural support network and community, and transportation supports to help the employer accomplish their identified goals. All of these supports are applicable for all SD service mixes, be that live-in, outside, or community-only supports. Support broker services are intended to monitor the plan, the services, and assist with documentation throughout the plan year. They are to meet with participants to monitor progress and are intended to link participants to services and supports as needed. There are limits on who can provide support broker services, as they cannot be provided by a parent, guardian, spouse, payee, or conservator. An individual providing support broker services must not be able to both influence an employer's decision-making and receive undue financial benefit from their decisions, and they cannot be employed by an agency that provides paid community supports to a participant they serve. Plan development is intended to assist the participant decide who to invite, the location, and how to run their person-centered planning meeting. It's intended to assess participants' needs and identify services to meet those needs, and to complete and submit the participant's support and spending plan. Fiscal employer agent services are intended and are required to be purchased in order to use the self-direction program, although the participant does have the right to choose who they receive those services from. Employers are required to attend a training course with the FEA of their choice, and they can transition by completing a necessary form to change who their FEA provider is. As a reminder, health, safety, and employment service categories for self-direction are job supports, adaptive equipment, and specialized nursing services. Skilled nursing or nursing oversight is a kind of service that should use the SNS code. This includes intermittent and continuous oversight and training, or skilled care that is within the scope of the Nurses Practices Act. This service must be referred by a physician or another practitioner of the healing arts. In order to receive this service, additional documentation must be submitted, including a nursing plan of care, the current license of the identified RN or LPN, and the physician referral. Participants who are looking to receive specialized medical equipment and supplies may do so using the AEQ payment category. This includes devices, controls, or appliances that help the participant to increase their ability to perform activities of daily living or to control or communicate within their home environment. This can include medically necessary equipment or supplies that are not covered through other insurance plans. There are also additional documentation requirements to use this service, including a denial of durable medical equipment by the medical care unit, except in a series of specific circumstances, including when seeking a diverter valve for a bathtub, eating or feeding utensils, lift devices, or wheelchair lifts. It also requires a letter from a physician or another practitioner of the healing arts recommending the specialized medical equipment and detailing how it is related to the participant's developmental disability, and that specialized medical equipment that costs more than $500 requires written documentation from an occupational physical or speech therapist or a speech pathologist to show that the purchase is appropriate to meet the participant's needs. A request for environmental accessibility adaptations can be made using the AEQ payment category. This can include minor housing adaptations that are necessary to enable the participant to function with greater independence. Permanent modifications are limited to a home that is owned by the participant or the participant's family. And portable or non-stationary modifications can be made if such a modification can follow the participant to their next place of residence. Additional documentation is required to show that the home is owned by the participant or the participant's non-paid family, a letter from a physician or another practitioner of the healing arts recommending the adaptation and explaining how it is related to the participant's disability, and at least quotes for having the work completed. That those quotes need to include a description of the work being done and the total cost, including itemized labor and supplies. Behavior consultation or crisis management can be used using the SNS payment code and is intended to provide direct consultation and clinical evaluation to participants who are experiencing or may experience a psychological, behavioral, or emotional crisis. It can also pay to provide a staff development related to such needs and emergency backup involving direct support. Additional documentation required is documentation to support that the participant is experiencing that type of crisis. Home delivered meals can be provided using the AEQ payment category. These are meals that are delivered to the participant's home to promote adequate nutrition. It can be up to 2 meals per day, but can only be provided to participants who rent or own a home, are alone for a significant part of the day, have no caregiver for extended periods, and are unable to prepare a meal without assistance. Personal Emergency Response Systems, or PERS, can also be procured using the AEQ payment category. This is an electronic device that enables the participant to secure help in an emergency. They may be able to wear a help button to allow for mobility. A response center must be staffed by trained professionals, and the service is limited to participants who rent or own a home or live with unpaid caregivers, are alone for significant portions of the day, have no caregiver for extended periods, and who would otherwise require extensive routine supervision. Additional documentation must show that the participant rents or owns their own home and that they have the skills necessary to use the PERS unit. Supported employment can be used using the JSS payment category and consists of competitive work in an integrated work setting. This service cannot be used for volunteer, unpaid, or work below the prevailing minimum wage. Additional documentation is required if there is transportation associated with employment services that will need to be separated from the budget using the budget modification employment mileage form. Again, that form will be described in more detail in part 2 of this training. Chore services can be provided using AEQ payment category. And this provides services necessary to maintain the functional use of the home to provide a sanitary and safe environment when neither the participant nor anyone else in the household is capable of performing or financially providing for such a task. It's limited to services that are provided in a home rented or owned by the participant. And if it's a rental property, it must not be the landlord's responsibility to maintain that space. Transition services are available and include goods and services that enable a participant exiting a nursing facility, hospital, IMD, or ICFID to transition to a community-based setting. Transition services are only available to participants who are currently using transition management benefit and is limited to $2,000 every 2 years. For a participant who wants to use this service, they need to be referred to the Idaho Home Choice for more information on obtaining that service. Now let's quickly discuss next steps associated with this training. First, please plan to attend part 2 of this training. It will be made available on both May 4th from 12:30 to 2:30 Mountain Time, as well as May 11th from 10:30 to 12:30 Mountain Time. Please also respond to a survey that we're offering about this training at the link listed here. I believe this link will also be emailed out to participants who received the invite for this training via email. This is an opportunity for you to give us some feedback and to let us know what additional information would be helpful to help you feel ready for transition to the new budget model. Please also be sure to share information about the trainings that are available for participants and families with your networks. Oftentimes, individuals who use services in their families can be the hardest for the department to reach, and we want to be sure that everyone has an opportunity to get information about the new budget model before it is implemented. With that, our presentation for today is concluded, so we will open it up for questions for the remaining time together.
So we have one question that has come through on, can a support broker be related by blood or marriage? I thought this was a new exception. So support brokers cannot be related by blood or marriage. This is a violation of IDAPA as well as a violation of the Code of Federal Regulations. We have a question about where can I find a list of trainings? The list of trainings and the links has been posted to the mychoicematters.idaho.gov website. You can find all of those there under the What's New button. We are still working to get a specific radio button on that website for trainings to make that easier to find. Not seeing any hands raised. Oh, I was just informed the trainings button is up and running. So the trainings list will also be posted under that button when you go to the My Choice Matters website and you click on trainings. The trainings will be listed under there. Not seeing any hands or additional questions at this time. Oh, I have a hand. Deb, if you could please unmute Tiffany Seidel so that she can ask her question.
Oops.
And Tiffany, I do hope that I pronounced your last name correctly.
You did. Thank you so much. My question is regarding the way that the American Rescue Plan is affecting CSW pay. I know it's negotiated. However, we have people, participants who transition from family directed into the self-direction program. Does that still count for those individuals whose CSWs are making between $16.99 and $20 an hour and are not HI certified? And then they come to the self-direction program. We turn in their plan, go through the whole process, and then all of a sudden their CSW has to make $16 or less. So they take a significant cut if they do stay with their participant. In the best interest of those participants who they've been making significant progress with, it would be nice to keep them at their same rates and not have to beg them to take the lower rate. It's supposed to be a negotiation, so I'm asking through that, do we have some kind of protection so that they can continue? Or being that they're a brand new participant to self-direction, does that mean that, nope, they start all over again with self-direction and negotiations?
So coming into the self-directed program from the children's program, they would
Yes.
have to negotiate those rates. We do go by prevailing market rate, which is around that $16 an hour at this point. However, if there is a health or safety reason or there can be a demonstration of why a higher rate would be required or needed, that participant can provide that information to the care manager through their support broker for review. Generally, we see things like higher degrees of education to deal with a specific health or safety need. And Cindy's on here; she can correct me if I'm misleading on any of this, but or if there's particular healthcare need or something of that nature that requires a higher level of training to meet the individual's need, that request can be made and evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And just to be aware, we are looking at that prevailing market rate as well to see if that needs to be adjusted. Seeing any additional hands. We do have a question asking if this presentation will be in recorded matter with the slides as well. So the presentation itself is being recorded in a video format that will be posted to the My Choice Matters website under that trainings button. As far as the slide deck being available, Alina, that will
The
be
slide
posted
deck
as well.
will also be posted separately. So folks can select to review the slide deck, or to review the entire recorded training, whatever works best for them.
Thank you. So there's a question, will the way we write plans change, or is that going to be covered in part 2 of this training?
That will be covered in part 2, but the short answer is there are not significant changes in how SSPs need to be written, but more detail will be provided in exactly new forms, new changes to costing sheets, and any minor changes that are happening as a result of the move to the new model. And I'll ask Cindy to correct me if I'm wrong on any of that, since she is our resident expert on that piece.
That all sounds correct.
Thank you. Deb, we have a hand raised. Would you unmute April so that April can ask her question?
Hi. So just for clarification, because I'm kind of new to the support broker end of things, where do we find the prevailing rate for CSWs? Where would where would we access that? Because I've had experienced support brokers say we submitted a plan and come back and it's denied because it's not what the prevailing rate is.
So the prevailing market rate is based upon information from the Internal Revenue Service and the Bureau of Labor Statistics that the department reviews based upon the job classification that closest matches CSW. And so, excuse me, yeah. And so it's based on that wage data. And so we are pulling that back out again and doing additional research to see if that needs to be adjusted. And then we do have a question asking, will support brokers be paid for this training? This training can be counted as continuing education. As we indicated, that would be tracking, but there is not a way for you to bill a participant for a training, attending this training, and it's not a direct service to the participant. It would be geared towards continuing education for you being able to do your job as a support broker. Scanning through. Not seeing any additional questions right at the moment. Seeing no additional raised hands.
I just put in the chat the link to the survey about this training. So people should be able to access it from there. It's a very short survey, just a couple of questions. We really would encourage everyone to give us some feedback. We will be doing quite a few of these trainings over the next couple of months and would love any of your feedback about what kind of additional information may be helpful or ways we can amend the training moving forward to be most useful for individuals taking it.
No additional questions, Selena.
All right, then with your blessing, Michael, I say we can let people have 3 minutes back in their day. I know those are hard fought for sometimes. Thank you all for participating in the training today. We really appreciate you being here. Please be sure to share information about the upcoming training with your colleagues or other support brokers or really other folks you come into contact with. We really want to make sure that everyone that interfaces with the Adult DD program have the information they need to be ready for the implementation of the new budget model. Thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.